All right, so tonight I wanted to talk about the third leg of my discussion on miracles. First of all, we talked to historian and New Testament scholar Dale Allison about the historicity of miracles, how we think about miracles from a historical perspective of the world in general and of the New Testament miracles in particular. Then I talked about the theology of Sergei Bulgakov, Eastern Orthodox theologian from the 1930s, who wrote about what was happening according to Christian theology and scripture in terms of what the miracles are. And now I want to talk about miracles and science fiction. And so that's maybe a little unexpected. So I want to kind of back up and talk about why I might go there. So, first of all, let's talk about the theology that we introduced in the last video. The theology of Sergei Bulgakov is that humanity has this capacity, this God-given aim, intention, end to do the things that miracles point to. So effectively, what we're seeing when we see miracles are glimpses of humanity's future. So, for example, when we see the story in Exodus of Moses parting the Red Sea, God commands Moses to do this, right? Moses seems to think for a second that God is just going to do it by himself. But God commands Moses to do it. And then Moses stretches out his staff and divides the sea, and a wind blows and it actually splits the sea for him, right? So this is God commanding a human to essentially command nature to do this work. And this is the picture of humanity as God intended that we see in Genesis 1 and 2. And then in the ultimate end of Scripture is humanity ruling the cosmos, ruling the forces of nature with their God-given power and ability. And so this miracle is solving a problem in the story for Israel, but it's also a pointer to what humanity is to become. Humanity is ultimately supposed to actually wield and rule the forces of nature towards creative and cultivating ends that are good and that are conducive to life. And so in this miracle, with the crossing of the Red Sea, we get a glimpse of what that might look like. So that's the theology, right? And if you think about that a miracle is a glimpse of humanity's future, then you can kind of see that has a lot of similarities with the purposes of science fiction and the aims and the work of science fiction, which is often to also show us a glimpse of humanity's future or a possible future, and to help us reflect on that and learn from it. So both miracle accounts and science fiction give us this ability to visualize the future so that we might actually apply those lessons to practical things we do today. So, for example, Christians who read the accounts of the healings in the Gospels understood that that this was like a pointer to humanity's ultimate destiny. We're going to cure all diseases. We're going to eradicate all illness. And the way that we can implement that today is we can go ahead and get started with our medical technology, with healthcare, with things like this. That's always been the understanding in Christian history ever since the earliest centuries. It's why hospitals are named things like St. Thomas and St. Mary and St. Joseph and so on. So that brings me to a very interesting idea, which C.S. Lewis explores in his Space Trilogy. This is one of the books. I think it's the second book in his Space Trilogy. And in the Space Trilogy, if you're familiar with C.S. Lewis, he's one of the most influential Christian thinkers of the 21st century, of the 20th century. And he's, is known for the Chronicles of Narnia, for a great deal of Christian work and Christian thought. In the Space Trilogy, he's doing something interesting. He's actually translating Christian concepts, the Christian cosmos as he sees it, into science fiction terms. Now, I don't think he's doing this just as as a sort of exercise or allegory or doing something clever to disguise from readers that he's talking about Christianity. So, for example, um, his depictions of angels in this series are these space traveling planetary rulers, planetary overlords that travel through space. Their natural habitat is space, and perhaps they're considered energy beings, something like this. So he deals with things like uh, the angels um, and the fall of man and all this kind of stuff. He talks about new races evolving on new planets and so forth, and being led through this garden process, like we see in the story of Eden. So he's mapping this biblical story and this Christian cosmos as he understands it onto science fiction terms. Um, and he's engaging it in this way. Merlin is cryonically preserved for millennia, like this kind of thing happens. So again, I don't think he's just doing an allegory. He's not just saying, oh, this is a convenient way to represent these ideas. He's doing something deeper and more involved in that. He's also not trying to hide his Christian convictions, although apparently a lot of people have read these stories and missed that he's talking about Christian ideas. So he is using fairly unfamiliar language to talk about them. I think that what he's doing is he's actually trying to envision, to imagine what it means to live in a Christian cosmos, because he believes in the Christian cosmos, and he also believes that it's the same it's the same cosmos as the scientific cosmos. Ultimately, these are the same things. There's not two realities here. There's one reality. And because there's one reality, then even though Christian thinking uses a particular kind of language and scientific thinking uses another kind of language, ultimately those two forms of language have to meet somewhere and have to be speaking about the exact same thing. So when he talks in this series about angels as these interplanetary overlords, he's trying to envision what that meeting place actually might be, right? And I think he's very clear about this in his larger work. He does not believe that the ancient ideas about the cosmos that we see in Christian theology and so forth are actually as outdated as they seem. So he'll talk about how the ancients thought about heaven as the sky, and in the Space Trilogy, he talks about the deep heaven being space. A lot of us in the modern era have tended to think, well, when they talked about heaven as the sky, this was a kind of naive idea. And he's very insistent that it's not. That in fact, space and the sky and all the things that are above us are in some sense deeply connected to the more spiritual sorts of things we associate with that, the expansiveness of the soul and somehow and so forth. And he thinks that in the ultimate culmination, the eschaton, that in fact we will see that those things are the same, and we can see a glimpse of that right now, right? When we see people go into space, as we have in the 20th and 21st centuries, we do feel a sense of the transcendent, right? It's not that the transcendent is actually this one thing over here, and space and the sky and heaven is this other thing over here. They actually are connected in a deep way. And our job as imaginers, as science fiction readers, as science fiction writers, is to try to figure out how those actually fit back together, right? That's the challenge. We know they're not actually as separate as they seem. So how do they fit back together? So C.S. Lewis is trying to do that in the Space Trilogy. I think if you asked him, is this what you literally think it is? Is this what you literally think is happening? I think he would say, well, maybe not that, but maybe something like that. And so his work here is to try to expand our imagination, expand the set of possibilities we're considering, not narrow it down, not hone in on just one um, particular construal of these things, but to bring us back to the idea that these are not separate universes, that the Christian universe is the scientific universe, if it's anything at all. And so ultimately, these need to be reconciled, these need to be brought together, and we need to never stop looking for the ways that they come together. I think that's a really important thing. I think it's something that it's very easy for Christian intellectuals, let alone Christian non-intellectuals, to skip that idea. It's easy to talk about things in our own little sphere of interest and influence. And we know people who understand our language and can talk with us and don't do the risky and brave thing of trying to actually bridge different worlds. But I think C.S. Lewis shows us we have to bridge those worlds if we actually want to be serious Christians. So this is what I think Lewis does for us, helps us to see. I think this is something we need to actively work on. So I'm going to talk about a few different ways in which people have tried to think about how to bring the kind of miraculous and kind of fantastical vision that we get in Christian scripture and theology into connection with the sort of science fiction themes that we can envision about the universe. So I want to talk about a few of those. The first one is kind of a freebie. It's time travel. Christians actually talk about time travel a lot. In my church, I hear all the time, Jesus is a traveler from the future showing us what God's future is like. Now, they mean that as a metaphor. They don't mean Jesus literally has a time machine or something like this. But there's an important theological sense in which Jesus is showing us the future and is a reflection of the future. And this even goes deeper into, if you go to very sacramental and liturgical churches, sometimes they will talk about what they are doing in church as a sort of travel to the future. They're participating in the eschatological banquet of the future. And so they're not having a new event every Sunday, something like that. They're participating in this ultimate Sunday, ultimate experience. And you can even think about this as you're taking the communion or the Eucharist, which is said to be the body and blood of Christ. In some way, this may be a participation in that initial sacrifice of Christ. You can also kind of apply this more dramatically and speculatively. When Jesus goes up on the mountaintop and is transfigured, and he is seen in the gospel speaking with Moses and Elijah, there's some people who take this as a sort of time travel scenario where time and space has collapsed. And so the moment that Jesus is up on this mountain is the same moment when Moses in the book of Exodus goes up to the mountain to meet with and speak with God. Right. And the God that Moses meets in the Old Testament seems to be humanoid in some sense, right? And so is that, and in fact, Jesus transcending space and time in that moment, meeting Moses there at the same moment that the disciples are there with Jesus on the mountain in the first century. So those are kind of wild and speculative thoughts, and you can see where this goes. But again, for the most part, people use this idea in terms of a metaphor about how Jesus is functioning. So let's push this a little bit farther. How can we get a little bit more imaginative and speculative? So the next most obvious idea is the idea that we live in a simulation or something like the Matrix. And if we live in something like that, then it is trivial for the Matrix architect to actually intervene and do something radical or amazing. The Matrix architect can intervene and raise Jesus from the dead simply by putting things back, rebooting from a backup, something like this, right? and all of a sudden something dramatic and miraculous can occur that would otherwise seem to be impossible. Yet it's right there in the mechanics. If we do live in something like a simulation, then it's obvious that this is completely possible. And it's totally possible that we do live in a simulation. It's a plausible thing to consider, regardless of what you think about the simulation argument and people talking about that. It's something we can't rule out a priori. So if we do live in something like that, then this could happen. And this is actually identical to the way that Christians have talked about miracles for the last few centuries, for the most part. So Christians will say something simplistic like, basically, God made it, he can break it, or something like, if God created the universe, he's able to intervene into it. And so they have the same sort of model as a matrix or a simulation situation. God controls all the parameters. God can do something with it. Charles Babbage, the inventor of the first computer, a mechanical computer in the 1800s, actually had the same kind of account of miracles. He thought that God programmed in miracles from the very beginning, just as he could program in particular events in a calculating machine. He imagined God could program in these miracles from the beginning. So it would not be breaking any laws of nature technically, but it would be doing something extraordinary and unexpected that could only have been put into it by the architect of the machine. So again, this is completely plausible as an explanation. It can also kind of explain everything. And one reason I kind of don't like it is I don't really love the theology of it. In my understanding, my reading of scripture, God is very concerned with empowering human beings and empowering human agency, so much so that when he gives us the dominion over the cosmos and calls us to rule the cosmos, then he basically commits himself to not breaking that rule that he's established. And so Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 will say that it has to come, the resurrection of the dead has to come through a human, because essentially God had covenanted with us not to break the nature that he had given us dominion over. So God won't intervene to raise Jesus or raise the dead arbitrarily or unilaterally. He will only do it as a human being. I think that's a remarkable claim on Paul's part, and I think it's also present in other things. After Noah in the Genesis story exits the ark, God establishes a rainbow to show that he will never again disrupt the processes of nature. I think God is essentially covenanting to us that he will not break the laws of nature, because he doesn't want to interfere with the rule that he has given us over it, and our rational capacity to understand what is happening. So a simulation sort of scenario is the way a lot of Christians will think about and talk about what God is doing, but I don't think it fits our best theology, because it still allows for, or actually has God doing things that are too disruptive to fit with his plan and his covenant. So that leads to a much more interesting proposal. Most of us these days are familiar with the idea of the multiverse. So the multiverse, if you watch Marvel movies, if you watch all kinds of, what is it? Everything, everywhere, all at once. There's a bunch of kind of cinematic treatments of the multiverse. We also know that our best understanding of the quantum physics is the many worlds interpretation, which says we live in a multiverse. So at the least, the idea of a multiverse is something that people can sort of wrap their heads around. Now, what's interesting about a multiverse is that if it's sufficiently big, then very rare things are happening in it all the time. So there are, in my timeline, mostly normal things happen, right? But in some far kind of improbable branch of the timeline right now, something crazy is happening, like the air molecules in this room coming together at just the right moment, in just the right direction to cause me to levitate in a way that would appear crazy, ridiculous, magical, something like this. It's vanishingly rare sort of thing, but it's happening somewhere in the multiverse because all the different dice are being rolled, all the different quantum probabilities are being explored out there. And so if you think about it like that, then even absurd and bizarre things are happening somewhere. David Deutsch, quantum physicist, inventor of the quantum computer, um, I think said something like, every coherent fictional story is true somewhere in the multiverse. So I think about something like, I think it's Elisha. He sees somebody drops an axe head into a river, and they're distraught because they've lost this valuable thing, and so he does some kind of thing and causes the axe head to float back to the top. Right now, this is ridiculous and impossible. Right, axe head can't float on water, and everybody knew that. That's why it's an interesting claim or an interesting story, is because everybody knows an axe head can't float on water. But somewhere in the multiverse, the water molecules have come together at just the right moment. The temperature, something happened, some combination of events where it could make an axe head spontaneously float for a moment, something like this. So why is that important? Most of us, assuming those things are happening somewhere in the remote corners of the multiverse, we would live a trillion lifetimes and never see these things. Why are they important? If it happens that some of those things are essential, some of these rare occurrences are essential for life to continue and to survive, then by definition, the only survivors will be in the branches of the multiverse where those things happened. So, for example, if for some reason my existence today was dependent on the existence of the ancient Jewish people, of their survival, if my survival till today was dependent on the survival of the ancient Jewish people for some reason, and if the survival of the ancient Jewish people was actually dependent on them crossing the Red Sea and escaping the Egyptians, then the only branch of the multiverse where I'm sitting here and talking to you is the branch where that happened, the Israelites survived, and I am here as a result, right? I can't prove or demonstrate any of those connections, those necessities there. But if we did think that something like that was true, that some kind of necessity like that was the case, then it would mean that we were necessarily in one of these rare branches of the multiverse. So again, if you think that perhaps, well, if it happened to be the case that humanity would not have survived to this point without the spread of Christianity, and that Christianity would not have ever gotten started unless the disciples became convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead. And if the disciples would never have become convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead unless he actually did, then the place where we find ourselves surviving, the branch of the multiverse we find ourselves in, would be the branch where that happened. Again, I can't demonstrate any of those connections. I can't make any kind of arguments for that. But it is a way of thinking about these miracles that's interesting, these miracle claims, right? If we're making those claims and that's kind of what's operative, then it might be that we're saying these specific things or something connected to them was actually crucial for the future of life. And that this kind of reasoning is very significant right now. If you're familiar with the Fermi paradox, and there's a concern, an intellectual concern. When we look at the night sky, we don't see all these civilizations out there. We see no civilizations out there. This leads to a concern that, well, maybe all kinds of civilizations are getting started, but all of them are destroyed before they reach the point where we could find them. And if so, then this is concerning, right? It would mean that we have or have gone through a lot of close calls, or we have some coming up in the near future, one or the other. And if that's what life is like, that life goes through very narrow, close calls where all life could be wiped out or destroyed, or just reach a dead end and never go further, then it might be that existence is this kind of risky thing where there are all these bottlenecks, all these great filters, where only a very narrow branch of the multiverse actually survives. And so, if this is the case, if the evidence of the absence of civilizations out there might be evidence that this is the case, that persisting through in existence as a species is actually this incredibly rare thing. We might, in fact, be in some kind of outlier branch of the multiverse, in which case we would expect, looking back at our past, to see these close calls and to see these near miraculous or fully miraculous events that helped us get through them. So that's one possibility to think about. Finally, there's this other question that I've been mulling over for a while. And that's the idea of the possibility of a single person singularity. Now, the singularity, as we normally speak about it, is an idea of essentially recursive self-improvement, where computing technology speeds up, giving us a kind of intelligence that we can put back to use in applying to computing technology, so that we get this recursive self-improvement and we ultimately surpass human level intelligence and reach superhuman intelligence. Now, Ray Kurzweil has predicted the singularity for the year 2045, when the intelligence available on a single desk is equivalent to the intelligence capacity of the entire human race. But I think to get to superhuman intelligence isn't actually as hard as it might seem. So human level intelligence, if we just look at the brain, I believe what we're working with is on the order of 1 exaflop, and the very fastest supercomputer in the world is a little bit beyond that right now. And this is just fairly recent, where we've had a computer that has surpassed this processing power of the human brain. Most of us have never seen or interacted with a computer that powerful. Most of the computers that we interact with are orders of magnitude less powerful than the human brain. So we have a vast amount of hardware and also storage capacity. There's no single computer that has the storage capacity of the human brain as well. So the human brain has incredible hardware capabilities that are basically at the top of what we have in computer technology or beyond it. Yet what we actually do with that is almost certainly suboptimal. So our actual kind of conscious processing ability is something like 10 bits per second, right? Orders of magnitude below the processing capacities of our actual brain. And I don't mean that our brain power is going unused. A lot of it's being used for visual processing, processing other parts of our, running our bodies and so forth. But it does seem like we probably could put that hardware to very powerful purposes if we had more control over it. And so there's the trope of like you only use 10% of your brain, which is false, but there might be a situation or it might be the case that um, the way in which we use our brain is so limited that um, there's effectively that kind of intelligence explosion available within a single human person. That is, that if we could rewrite the software of our brain, the operating system of our brain, and sort of take full control over it, that it would be possible to use all of that hardware in the most efficient way possible and to achieve what would appear to anyone currently living on Earth as superhuman intelligence. If I want to extend that a little bit further, humans can already use aspects of their environment to offload and extend their own processing capacities. We do this all the time when we use books, when we communicate with via language with other people. So a superhuman intelligence could certainly do the same, which would give them even more potential processing power and intelligence. And the easiest way to extend that kind of power would be to extend it through other people, right? So if you could take a problem you were working on and transmit it to someone else and have them work on it for a while and give you the result back, that would be an incredible way of extending your own computational intelligence. We do this, right? We do this actively in a lot of ways. We do it in just our normal economic exchange. We ask people to do things for us, but we also do it in more subtle ways, in emotional ways, where we are asking people to do emotional processing for us, or asking people for advice, or telling them something and then observing how they react to it so that we can learn something from their reaction. That's what we do. Superhuman intelligence would probably be capable of doing that at a level that we would find unbelievable. So it seems possible to me that if a human could fully take control of and rewrite their own brain operating system, perhaps a little bit at a time, perhaps recursively improving it, that they could achieve a level of intelligence with the existing brain resources that we would identify as superhuman. And if they wanted to go beyond that, we could take that to just unimaginable levels of superhuman type intelligence. Could that kind of process happen in a single person in a single lifetime in the ancient world? If it did, this would be an interesting idea theologically, because it really would be a vision of our future, of what we could and will become ultimately. It would be a human that had taken all of the human capacities upon themselves and been able to show us what that would be like. They would also be capable of things that we would identify absolutely as miracles. If there's a super intelligence running around first century Palestine, then you would see all kinds of unbelievable things. So theologically, this is interesting because it offers us a way of thinking about what was happening to the humanity of Christ and perhaps to the humanity of other prophets and so forth that seems plausible from a scientific perspective. I know people will argue about the scientific, the biological thing that's going on here, but it seems plausible. It matches the theology that we've been talking about, where God seeks to empower human beings by empowering them, by allowing them to exercise their true nature in the cosmos, and showing us a vision of our own future. This sort of matches that theology and scientific plausibility and so forth in a very interesting way. And I think it would take, like, what would it take to be able to reprogram your brain like that? Well, we already do reprogram our brains. We know that our brains are very plastic. We know that even from injury, we can recover in really interesting and amazing ways. We know that by learning and training ourselves, we can grow in really profound ways. But I think we just don't know enough about ourselves, about the operating system of our brains, to take the kind of control that I'm talking about. Yet it ultimately must be an epistemological process, a process that somebody could learn to take this kind of control. I imagine as we get different kind of feedback mechanisms, we'll see something more like this in the future as we are able to track our own biological brain processes, perhaps through brain-computer interfaces, which tell us what's happening. We'll learn more about the brain, and then we'll be able to actually control it much more directly with our conscious thought, and probably experience it much more expansively. But that process of learning might also be a process that overlaps with processes of spiritual development or spiritual discipline. So we see this kind of claim in some places. People, who are extreme meditators will talk about being able to control their heart rate and aspects of their nervous system and things like that. Maybe the temperature of their skin. There's no reason why you wouldn't be able to control that kind of thing. So that's not implausible to me. It seems like the kind of thing that could happen. And if that kind of spiritual discipline could give you that kind of access or power over your own operating system, then maybe there are deeper spiritual disciplines, a deeper process of spiritual discipline that actually might lead to the kinds of transformation I'm talking about. And of course, even so, it would probably be incredibly improbable. But if it's possible, then it's happening somewhere in the multiverse, right? So anyway, those are some thoughts. Could there be a superhuman intelligence that booted up within a human brain at one or more points in history? Could there be a superhuman intelligence that was distributed across a community of brains that got started at a point or points in human history? Might this be the kind of thing that's necessary for us to survive in this particular branch of the multiverse? Or is the simulation architect simply intervening and rewriting the code as they see fit? Those are some possibilities to think about. And again, expanding the set of possibilities, not narrowing it. I'd love to hear the possibilities that come to your mind about how some of these things might work. We live in the universe, and we live in a scientific and technological, biological, physical world. And ultimately, our theology has to meet that somewhere, because that's what it's all about. That's why we deal with it in the first place. So let me know your thoughts, and I look forward to some crazy comments and reactions. So thanks. Good evening.